Ladies and gentlemen, I am SidAlpha, and if there's one thing that is synonymous with the console gaming industry, it is the console wars. The console wars are, as we all know, the constant battle between Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo for who gets to sit on top of the console market. What follows off of that near constant battle between corporations is the fanboys that follow them and regurgitate PR talking points or invent some of their own, sometimes completely without factual merit in an effort to protect and prop up their preferred console. And nothing has typified that fanaticism in recent days than what we have seen come out from the FTC versus Microsoft legal case, where the FTC is attempting to get the court system to enter a temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction to block the acquisition of Activision by Microsoft, ostensibly under the guise of preventing harm to competition. This is due to the FTC's claims that the acquisition might violate U.S. antitrust law, specifically Section 7 of the Clayton Act. But this video, or at least my intent behind it, is not to perform a legal breakdown of those proceedings. I'm not a lawyer, and while my knowledge of the U.S. copyright law is, I think I can safely say, above the level of layman, I am by no means a legal expert, nor am I even remotely qualified to provide the nuanced interpretation needed for such a lawsuit. No, my purpose here is to hopefully inject maybe a little bit more sanity back into the thriving arguments we're seeing from PlayStation fanboys and also from Xbox fanboys. And as is always the case, this argument ultimately spins from the subject of exclusivity, something that has run rampant within the console gaming industry for as long as I can remember, and it is also something that PC gamers fervently hate. We saw a perfect example of that with when the Epic Games Store launched promising paid timed exclusives to developers and publishers to prevent those games from being sold on Steam. Because with PC gaming, there is no platform exclusivity. The closest thing you could find up until that point was if the game ran on Linux or not, which I personally feel as many games as possible should be available on as many systems as possible. After all, games should be there for gamers to enjoy, not to be used as marketing pieces to sell hardware or as fuel for fanboys to mock their perceived opposition with a "look what game we got, don't you wish you had it, sucks to be you" sort of mentality. Well, as platform exclusivity was not realistically possible on PC, Epic Games had chosen to use the mentality behind it in order to create distribution exclusivity by way of paying game developers and publishers for timed exclusive distribution rights. Ironically enough, that was actually not the first time that distribution exclusivity has been attempted on PC, and that was covered back on the fairly early days of my channel all the way back to 2016, where I discussed the enjoining of the Microsoft App Store in Xbox Live, where in that video, which on a completely unrelated tangent, it's never fun for someone like myself to go back to videos that old, as my diction was not nearly at the level that it is now and my audio was absolutely terrible, which, let's face it, is true for most relatively new channels. But still, it was jarring for me to be reminded of what my content sounded like back then. Regardless, let's get back on topic. In that, I discussed how Microsoft had previously attempted such a thing with Games for Windows Live on the Windows Vista operating system, where within Games for Windows Live, Microsoft attempted to lock the games being offered, specifically Shadowrun and Halo 2, to the Windows Vista operating system, where people at the time that purchased those games through Games for Windows Live were forced to crack those games to allow them to run on the much more popular and much better Windows XP. I know we're going back to ye olden times here. The Games for Windows Live also would not allow the gamer to directly purchase the game. Microsoft forced people to purchase Microsoft points, which were then used to purchase the game, which also harkens back to what we see with premium currency within video games, where the numbers don't line up to where you would be highly incentivized to purchase the next larger package and also invariably have some points left over. And this was, to my knowledge, the first time that the concept of distribution exclusivity was introduced to PC gaming in an effort to compete with Steam. And that initial attempt failed miserably. Microsoft has since successfully integrated the Microsoft Store with Xbox Live and have used that for distribution exclusivity, although they seemingly no longer seek to directly combat Steam very much in that regard, most likely choosing to focus their efforts on the console wars instead and using that distribution exclusivity as a selling point to one-up Sony in that regard, making games available for Xbox and for the PC market simultaneously. Now, alongside that, we all know that Sony and Microsoft have vied for paid exclusives for years, hell, decades. Those paid exclusives, most timed but some permanent, along with first-party IP, have been at the core of the exclusivity battle. And that exclusivity battle is, of course, to sell hardware, which locks people into purchasing those games from one corporation or the other. It is, put simply, distribution exclusivity by way of required hardware. Hardware that has been historically and consistently behind the curve, only being considered roughly comparable to industry current with the latest generation release, which then loses ground as newer, more powerful technologies are released and those physical platforms are not created in such a way that they can have components upgraded outside of their storage. It is also worth noting that more often than not, these corporations do sell those platforms at a loss or at a barely break-even rate, relying on their income to be generated through the sales of the games on their platforms and through microtransaction monetization. In October 2022, Phil Spencer told Wall Street Journal's Tech Live that Microsoft loses up to $200 on every console sold. With the PlayStation 4, it was reported that the hardware rated at a loss of $60 per unit, although that margin lessened to where the PlayStation 4 was no longer selling at a loss after roughly 6 months due to the cost of the hardware coming down and the refining of their manufacturing design. On August 4, 2021, Sony reported that the PlayStation 5 was no longer selling at a loss due to similar factors. Now, this is behavior that is ubiquitous across all consoles and is not something that is likely to change anytime soon. Consoles are sold at a loss or an initial loss in order to create that distribution exclusivity for video games and to lock microtransactions sold through their respective marketplaces. In addition, the platform specs for consoles, while initially on par or even impressive considering the hardware sales prices, quickly flags behind the industry in terms of the strength of that hardware, which forces games developers to get rather creative in how they optimize games for those platforms to be able to squeeze out every ounce of performance from those machines that they can. This was clearly evident when you look at the large spans of time between console generation releases. For the PlayStation, it seems to be on a 7-year rotation, and for Xbox, that varies between 7 and 8 years, where there was one exception where the Xbox 360 released 4 years after the original Xbox. Now, I lay all of this information out there because console hardware strength is hotly debated between their respective fan bases, while their ultimate performance is at a rough parity with each other, at least in this latest generation, where the performance differences are minor enough that the end user is likely to be unable to benefit from a noticeable improvement of one versus the other, although that statement is likely to be hotly contested by both Xbox and PlayStation fanboys. I'm looking forward to the comments on that one. One perfect example of this is the Change.org petition, where a PlayStation fanboy is seeking to make Starfield, a game being developed by Bethesda and currently owned by Microsoft, to be a PS5 exclusive. And I point this out not to rip on PlayStation fans specifically, but to show that this is the type of mentality that you see exhibited by both fandoms. Now, in it, they state, Xbox exclusivity would not only hurt PlayStation, but also the player base. When a major game like Starfield is only available on Xbox, it limits the player count of the game and stifles the amount of players PlayStation has. This means that now Microsoft can charge higher prices because they don't have competition and take away players from Sony. Let's take a moment to look at that in reverse. And for that, we're going to do a little inspect element to make a couple of alterations so you can have a visual to go along with it. PlayStation exclusivity would not only hurt Xbox, but also the player base. When a major game like Starfield is only available on PlayStation, it limits the player count of the game and stifles the amount of players Xbox has. This means that now Sony can charge higher prices because they don't have competition and take away players from Microsoft. Either statement is essentially true, at least in a couple of areas, and those areas will become readily apparent if viewed from an objective standpoint, as opposed to the position of a fanboy who despises the other side and views them as the enemy. Exclusives do hurt the opposition, they do limit the player base, and it does limit competition. Again, those are equally true statements, regardless of if it is Sony or Microsoft who are doing it, and they both do it and have done it for years. But this is something that both sides of the console argument keep conveniently forgetting, that their side of the console wars are every bit as guilty of such behavior as the other. It is very much the pot calling the kettle black. Now, I could continue on and pick apart this entire Change.org petition, but that's not the ultimate purpose of my being here talking about this. Now, in the Microsoft acquisition of Activision, or the intended acquisition, PlayStation fans are claiming they are only doing this to enforce exclusivity, that it is an escalation to see Sony destroyed. which, from seeing what is happening with the FTC litigation, Microsoft recognizes they simply are not in a position to do that. But lest we forget, Sony has been happily buying up game studios as they go along as well. Naughty Dog, Guerrilla Games, Insomniac Games, Media Molecule, Ben Studio, and more. They also own stakes in Devolver Digital, FromSoft, and Epic Games. Now, on May 22nd of this year, Game Rant reported, quote, Sony is reportedly planning to bolster its PlayStation division further by acquiring more studios. Sony has been on an acquisition spree over the past 2 years, and it is seemingly looking for more studios to boost its position in the global gaming market. There has been a visible move towards consolidation in the video game industry considering the high-profile acquisitions that were completed recently. For instance, Microsoft acquired ZeniMax and a number of other studios, with Sony following suit by acquiring 5 studios in 2021 alone. However, the Japanese tech giant's most significant acquisition came in 2022 when Sony acquired Destiny 2 and former Halo developer Bungie for $3.6 billion. Now, the conglomerate is looking to reinforce its position globally by allocating more funds for more such acquisitions. So while PlayStation fanboys are screaming about Microsoft's attempts to acquire Activision, they either do not know, fail to remember, or conveniently forget that Sony has been actively doing the exact same thing. Studio acquisitions have merely become the natural progression of these corporations' attempts to vie for dominance and to continue their time-honored tradition of holding on to the concept of exclusivity. Something that console fanboys absolutely hate when it means they don't get a game, but seemingly enjoy lording it over their perceived opposition when the shoe's on the other foot. But maintaining perspective is important. Exclusivity is bad, and it does negatively impact gamers. Of course, without those exclusives, there would be very little incentive for these companies to sell consoles for the prices that they do, which ultimately would be fine as long as the manufacturer allowed for those consoles to be upgraded. Newer CPUs, newer GPUs, more RAM, larger storage capacity, all of that would ultimately be beneficial to console gamers. And hell, you could even still maintain the anti-consumer practice of paid exclusives on top of that, but that is all it is. Paid exclusives are anti-consumer. Studio acquisitions in order to maintain such exclusives is inherently anti-consumer at its very core. But unfortunately, console fanboys think it's perfectly fine when their side does it, even encourage and cheer for it, but then turn around and rage whenever it is done to them in return, all the while being the epitome of the pot meeting the kettle, where the reality is, it is bad for the industry when either side does it. It is bad for a PlayStation gamer when PlayStation does it. It's bad for a PlayStation gamer when Xbox does it. It's bad for an Xbox gamer when PlayStation does it. You get the idea. So whether you're an Xbox fanboy or a PlayStation fanboy, the next time you think to get outraged over the other side blocking you from playing a game that you want to enjoy, take a step back and think about how your side does it with just as much regularity. And maybe, just maybe, if those fanboys were to suddenly turn around and decry both corporations for such actions, those anti-consumer practices might begin to change. But then again, what do I know? I'm just a mook with a mic. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, I am SidAlpha, and I'll see you next time.